In the previous video, we saw how to work with libraries that return promises. But what if you're using an older Node library that doesn't return promises and just takes callbacks? So let's take a look at converting those into promised versions for our code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new JavaScript file, and I'll call it convert. And let's start by writing a function that follows the classic Node pattern for callback functions. So let's call this do something. And it's going to take an argument x and a callback function. And then we want to do something that's truly asynchronous here, just for demonstration purposes. And so an easy asynchronous function we can use is set timeout. So set timeout, and that's going to take a function that gets called, and it's going to take an amount of time to delay. So let's say 5,000, let's say 2,000 milliseconds, because 5,000 is 5 seconds. That's 2 seconds. 5's a little too long, I think. And what this will do is it will wait 2 seconds and then it will execute this function. So inside the function, what we want to do is let's go ahead and write a function that doesn't take any arguments. And I'm going to start by picking a random number. So that's going to return a number between 0 and 1, a floating point number. And then we'll say if val is less than 0.5, that's an error condition. And so the classic pattern is to call the callback with a new error, val too low. So there's a val too low error. And if val is not less than 0.5, that's a success condition. So we're going to say else callback, and we pass null in for the error. And let's return x times val for the value. So it's going to take whatever I pass in here, multiply it by a random number that's greater than or equal to 5, and return, actually call the callback with that value. So then that's the classic pattern for callback functions in Node. Let's go ahead and use it. So I'm going to write a function main. And what are we going to do? We're going to call do something. And we'll pass in, say, 1,000. And then our callback function will take air and data. If air, then console dot error error, else success console dot log success with data. And let's go ahead and add a console.error failure. Okay, so this is a classic callback. So this is a classic asynchronous function that takes a callback. And here I'm calling that asynchronous function and passing in a callback. And then let's call main to kick it off. And let's try running it. So I'm going to call convert. Oh, and cannot find module convert. Oh, I'm not in the right folder. Hold on. cd callback hell. Now let's try it. Okay, so it waits 2 seconds, and then I got a failure. Success, and that's 1,000 times a number that's 0.5 or greater. and a failure. Great. So that's all working correctly. So how do I turn this into something that returns promises instead of something that takes callbacks? And this will work whether I actually have access to the source code or not. What I'm going to do is create a wrapper function that sits outside of do something, and the wrapper function will return a promise, and it will create the promise based on what do something does. So this is going to be a function called do something promisify. I'll just call it do something promise. And do something takes x, so do something promise needs to take x. Do something promise does not need to take a callback because it's going to return a promise. And then we're going to return a new promise. And then the trick here is that the constructor for promise takes something called an executor function. So an executor function takes two parameters, one called resolve and one called reject. Oops. And the way it works basically is I'm going to call do something, and in the callback for do something, if I'm either going to get an error in the callback, or I'll get null for the error and some data. And then if I get an error, then what I want to do is call reject with that error. And if I get null for the error and I get some data, then I want to call resolve with the data. So let's call do something. And we're going to pass in a callback. Actually, we'll pass in x, and then we'll pass in a callback, which takes an error and data. And then if error, then I call reject error, else I call resolve data. So where do these resolve and reject functions come from? Well, what happens is I'm going to go ahead and not call main. Let's say let promise equal do something under promise, and I pass in 100. This is going to return a promise object. And then if I say promise dot then, I'm going to get a value, and I'm going to console dot log success comma value. So when I execute this piece of code here, it's going to take this function and it's going to pass that into the executor as this resolve function. And then if I have a catch clause, which is going to get an error, console.error, failure, and error. If I have this catch clause, this function here is going to get passed in as the reject function. So it works just like a callback, except that I can sort of attach this anytime, and I can have multiple ones and so on. So let's go ahead and execute this and see what we get. And it should work exactly the same if I've done everything correctly. Okay, so we get a success. Oh, it's only 66. Because I'm only passing in 100 instead of 1,000. So now it should do the same thing. So val too low, that was a failure. Val too low is a failure. Success 790. Failure. Yeah, seems to be working. All right. So once again, what I've done is I've taken a function that takes a callback and I've wrapped it. I sort of intercept, make my own callback that calls the executor function to a promise object and call resolve or reject inside of the callback. And then when I hook in the then and catch clauses, everything just works fine. So that works for something that follows the standard callback convention from Node, where you get a callback that takes an air value as the first parameter, and then one or more, 0 or more data parameters after that. But what if you're working with a function that doesn't follow that standard convention? Well, let's take a look at an example of that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy do something and create a function called do something to, and it's going to look just like do something, except instead of passing the error back as the first parameter and the value as the second parameter, let's pass the value first. So it's going to be null here and data there. And then we'll pass back the error, if there is one, as the second parameter. Now, since we have control over the wrapper function, it's pretty easy to adjust for that. So function do something to promise is going to look exactly like do something promise. It's going to return a new promise, which is going to take resolve and reject. And the only difference is that when it calls do something to, passes in x, it's going to get back data comma error instead. And then all the rest is the same. So if error, then reject error, else resolve data. So that was a simple adjustment because the order of the arguments was different. And if I replace do something promise with do something to promise, oops, line 60, did I not call it do something to promise? I misspelled promise. Okay, so I finished successfully. Failure. Do something to is not defined. So I have another little problem there. So there's do something. Oh, I forgot to rename that to do something to. Okay, so too low. A number seems to be working the same. So we could also deal with something like, let's change do something to, and it's always going to call the callback with an object that has two properties. So there's going to be an error property and a value property. And then here too, we're going to call the callback with an object. And the data property, let's call the val property, is like so. And the error property is null. Okay. So then in our wrapper function, what we want to do is check whether air, we're going to take one object coming back, and then if obj.air, then we reject obj.air. Otherwise, we resolve obj.value. Okay, so this should do the same thing as before. Too low. And just right. Okay, so it seems to be working. So as long as you know the function that you're calling, how it deals with error conditions and how it deals with success conditions, if you know that, you can correctly call resolve and reject for the promise that you're returning. Now, since the classic Node callback pattern is so common, there's actually there's a utility in the utility package that's really handy if you run across this. So I'm going to go ahead and require the util package. And inside of util is something called promisify. And I can const do something promisify is equal to util.promisify, and that's a function that I pass another function into. So if do something is a function that takes a callback as the last argument, it can have any number of parameters, and then the last one is a callback, and the callback takes an error as the first parameter and then any number of arguments after that. If it fits that pattern, then util.promisify will automatically do the same kind of thing as I've done here manually. So it returns a function that returns a promise when I call it. So down here, I'm going to go ahead and change that to be do something of promisify, and it should work the same. Seems to be working the same. Saved me a little effort. Yep. So now, once again, it is relying on the code to follow that standard pattern. So if I have something non-standard, like this do something to, actually this do something to, and I try wrapping that, something to promisify, unfortunately, this will not work correctly. So let's go ahead and call that here. And exactly what I get will depend on what's going on. But so basically, since it's always returning an object for the first parameter, actually, this looks like it's doing the same thing. Let's get rid of that line. So it should display success val or failure error. Do something to.promisify. So it should always be returning an object as the first value to the callback. Okay, so now it's doing what I was expecting. So it thinks that this is an error. It always thinks I'm passing in. I'm always getting an error, so it's always calling the failure clause. The catch is always working and not the throw. So that's not doing what I want it to. And even when it returns a value, it's still returning an object in the first position, so it still thinks it's a failure. Now, if that's the case, there are ways of using util.promisify with non-standard argument patterns. But at a certain point, I personally find it easier to just go ahead and make my own promise object and directly call what I need to call. So your mileage may vary. But either way, it doesn't seem like it's generally that hard to adapt a callback style to use promise wrappers.